It is the dead of night on the 25th of December, 1776. On the Pennsylvania bank of the Delaware River, a blizzard is coming down out of the darkness, and the river itself is alive with ice, great grinding slabs of it turning slowly in the black water. And there, at the freezing edge of it, in a wind that cuts to the bone, a defeated general is loading a few thousand starving men into open boats. His name is George Washington. His army is a wreck, and the password he has given his men for this night is not a word of comfort. It is a warning: victory or death. Because that is exactly the choice in front of them. If this gamble fails, if the boats go over, if the cannon are lost to the river, if the enemy is awake and waiting on the far shore, then the war is finished, the rebellion collapses, and the United States of America dies in the snow before it was ever truly born. This is the story of the most desperate night in American history. The story of an attack that no one, on either side, believed a beaten army would ever have the nerve to make. To understand how close to death the American cause truly was that Christmas, you have to understand the 6 months that came before it. Because 1776 did not end in glory, it ended in retreat. The year had started with such hope. In July, the Continental Congress had signed the Declaration of Independence, and for a moment, the 13 colonies believed they were about to shrug off the greatest empire on earth. Then the British arrived to answer that declaration. They came with the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever sent overseas. Thousands of hardened regulars, and beside them thousands of Hessians, professional German soldiers hired to crush the revolt. What followed was not a war of independence, it was a rout. Washington was beaten on Long Island. He was driven out of New York City. He lost Fort Washington and thousands of men taken prisoner in a single afternoon. And then began the long, humiliating retreat, backward across New Jersey, town after town, the British always a day behind, the American army bleeding men at every mile. By December, what was left of the Continental Army had been pushed all the way across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, and it was barely an army at all. A few thousand men, ragged and hungry, many of them without shoes, wrapped in whatever they could find against the cold. They were unpaid. They were sick, and the British and their Hessian allies now held New Jersey, spread out in winter garrisons, entirely confident that the rebellion would simply freeze to death on its own before spring. And there was a deadline hanging over Washington that was worse than any British army. Enlistments. Most of his soldiers had signed up for a fixed term, and for the bulk of them, that term expired on the 31st of December, in a matter of days. When the new year came, these men had every legal right to pick up their muskets, turn around, and go home. And who could blame them? They had followed this general through nothing but defeat. They were cold, they were owed money that never came, and the cause they had joined looked, by every measure, already lost. So this was the arithmetic Washington was staring at. In less than a week, the calendar itself would dissolve his army. He would wake up one morning a commander with almost no one left to command, and when that happened, there would be no Continental Army to stop the British in the spring. The revolution would not be defeated in battle. It would simply evaporate. Across the colonies, people could feel it slipping away. The mood had gone from defiance to despair. Many who had cheered independence in July were now quietly certain, by December, that the whole thing had been a doomed mistake. It was into that darkness that a voice spoke. A writer named Thomas Paine, who had marched with the retreating army and seen the misery firsthand, put pen to paper that December and produced a pamphlet called The American Crisis. And it opened with words that have never stopped echoing. These are the times that try men's souls. He wrote of the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot who would shrink from the service of their country in a crisis like this, and he wrote that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Washington had those words read aloud to his freezing troops. And you can imagine the effect. Men huddled around fires that barely held back the cold, listening to someone finally say out loud what the moment demanded of them. But Washington knew that words alone would not hold his army together past the 31st. Inspiration fades. What men needed now was proof. Proof that this cause was still alive. Proof that the enemy could be hurt. He needed a victory, any victory, something to make a soldier believe it was worth signing on for one more term, something to make the colonies believe the war was not already over. And out of that desperation, Washington reached for a plan so audacious it bordered on madness. His eyes fixed on the town of Trenton, New Jersey, just across the river. Trenton was held by a garrison of roughly 1,400 Hessians, professional German soldiers, commanded by Colonel Johann Rall. These were not amateurs. They were among the most feared troops in the world, disciplined, drilled, and confident. And that confidence was exactly what Washington intended to use against them. Here was the design. On the night of the 25th of December, under the cover of a winter storm and the distraction of the Christmas holiday, when any attack seemed impossible, Washington would secretly recross the Delaware River. He would move his whole striking force back onto the New Jersey shore in the dark, march roughly 9 miles through the night, and fall on Trenton at first light, hitting the town from more than one direction at once. Several crossings were planned along the river to trap the garrison, and the watchword, passed quietly down the ranks, captured everything the night was: victory or death. It was a plan that depended entirely on doing the one thing the enemy was absolutely certain a beaten army would never attempt. No sane, defeated commander recrosses an ice-choked river in a blizzard to attack elite troops on Christmas night, which was precisely why it might work. But first, they had to survive the river. And the river very nearly ended the whole thing before a single shot was fired. Because the weather that night did not just turn cold, it turned murderous. What began as snow built into a full nor'easter, a screaming storm of snow, then sleet, then hail, driven sideways by a wind that tore at the men and the boats alike. And the Delaware, already dangerous, was now clogged with ice, jagged flows grinding down the current in the dark. The man given the impossible job of getting the army across was Colonel Henry Knox, Washington's artillery commander, a big, booming former bookseller with a gift for organization. Knox and his men worked through that black, howling night, poling the heavy Durham boats, long, high-sided cargo boats, through the ice, ferrying men, horses, and hardest of all, the cannon. Because Washington was not just moving infantry, he was hauling field artillery across a frozen river in a storm, guns that would prove decisive at dawn if they could only get them over. It was agonizingly, dangerously slow. Every crossing fought the ice and the current and the wind. Hour after hour bled away, and the army fell further and further behind the schedule the plan depended on. And downriver, the plan began to come apart. The two supporting crossings that were meant to trap the Hessians could not get through. The ice was too heavy, the conditions too brutal, and both were abandoned. That meant only one force was going to reach the far shore, Washington's own. Roughly 2,400 men, cold, soaked, and by the time the last of them stood on the New Jersey bank, hours behind time, with the winter dawn now racing toward them. Think for a moment about what that crossing actually asked of ordinary men. To stand in an open boat in a blizzard at night, black water and jagged ice on every side, holding a frightened horse steady, or bracing a cannon that could tip you into the river in a heartbeat. To do it not once, but back and forth, hour after hour, hands frozen to the poles, knowing that a single capsized boat could mean drowned men and lost guns this army could never replace. There was no glory in that work, no cheering crowd, no drums, no banners. There was only the cold, the dark, the grinding ice, and the quiet, stubborn refusal to quit. And somehow, through all of it, they did not quit. Washington stood on that far shore and faced a decision that would define everything. He was late. dangerously late. The darkness that was supposed to hide his approach was running out. By every cautious instinct, the sensible thing was to call it off, to recross before daylight exposed them in the open. He did not call it off. He understood something colder than caution. Turning back now was just as deadly as going forward, maybe more so, because there might never be another chance before his army dissolved on the 31st. So he gave the order to march. The army split into two columns, one under General Nathaniel Greene, the other under General John Sullivan, so they could strike Trenton from two directions at once and cut off escape. And then those 2,400 men set off into the storm, marching roughly 9 miles through the snow and the dark, muskets wrapped against the wet, heads down against the wind. Some of the men had no proper shoes, and it is written that they left blood in the snow behind them, footprints marked in red along the road to Trenton. 2 men lay down in the cold that night and never got up, frozen to death on the march. And still the columns pushed on, because everything now, the whole gamble, the whole revolution, rested on one thing: reaching the town before the garrison woke. Now, if this story means anything to you, if you believe a moment like this, where everything came down to the courage to do the impossible, deserves to be told properly and remembered, then take 1 second right now to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps these stories reach more people. Because what these frozen, bleeding men were about to do at dawn is the part that changed history. Dawn, the 26th of December. The 2 American columns, marching by separate roads, arrived at the edge of Trenton almost at the same time, just after first light, and fell on the town. And here we have to correct one of the most famous myths in American history, honestly, because the truth is better than the legend. You have probably heard that the Hessians were caught because they were drunk, sleeping off a wild Christmas party. That story grew up later, and it is almost certainly false. The Hessians were not helpless drunks. What they were was exhausted. They had spent weeks being harassed by American patrols and alarms. They were worn down, on edge, and above all they simply did not believe, could not imagine, that anyone would attack them through a storm like that, on that morning, after everything the rebels had suffered. Their guard was down not because of wine, but because of certainty. They were certain the war was as good as won. That certainty was their undoing. The surprise was very nearly total. American cannon, the same guns Knox had dragged across the river, were rushed to the head of the main streets and opened fire straight down them. The Hessians, tumbling out of their quarters into the snow and the noise, tried to form up as soldiers of their quality were trained to do, but the storm and the artillery gave them no room. Their own guns were overrun before they could be brought to bear. What followed was sharp, chaotic, and fast, a fight of well under 2 hours. The 2 American columns pressed in from both ends of the town, closing like a vice, while the cannon dominated the streets and would not let the Hessians organize. Colonel Rall, their commander, did what a brave officer does. He got on his horse and tried to rally his men in the open, to lead a counterattack and break the trap. And in the storm of fire sweeping those streets, Rall was struck down, mortally wounded, and fell from the saddle. With their commander dying and their formations broken, the Hessians were pushed back, surrounded, cornered in the streets and in an orchard at the edge of town, cut off from any road out. And then, remarkably quickly, it was over. The result was so lopsided it is almost hard to believe. Around 900 Hessians were captured, roughly 20 were killed, and dozens more wounded, including the dying Colonel Rall. And the American losses, in combat, were astonishingly light. Only a handful of men wounded. Among those wounded was a young officer named James Monroe, who took a musket ball but survived, and who would one day become the 5th President of the United States. The only American deaths that terrible night were the 2 men lost not to the enemy, but to the cold, on the march. Washington did not linger to celebrate. He knew the British had powerful forces nearby who would come the moment word spread, so he gathered up his 900 prisoners, along with the captured muskets, cannon, and supplies, and recrossed the Delaware back to Pennsylvania, hauling his stunned captives over that same murderous river. By the numbers, it was a tiny battle. A few hundred casualties in a war that would see far bloodier days. But its effect was out of all proportion to its size. Because Trenton was not really a battle for territory. It was a thunderclap aimed at the mind of a nation. News of the victory raced through the colonies, and it landed like lightning in a dark sky. After 6 months of nothing but defeat and retreat, here, at last, was a win. A clean, stunning, unmistakable win. Elite enemy troops beaten and marched off as prisoners. Men whose enlistments were days from expiring now agreed to stay. New recruits came forward. A cause that had looked, a week earlier, like a corpse was suddenly, visibly, defiantly alive. And Washington was not finished. Within days, he crossed back into New Jersey a third time, and in the first week of January 1777, he struck again, fighting off a British counterattack at the Second Battle of Trenton, and then slipping around the enemy to win another victory at Princeton. In the space of about 10 days, Washington had gone from a general about to lose his entire army to a commander who had won 3 fights, cleared much of New Jersey, and proven the first victory was no fluke. Historians would later give that span a name. The 10 crucial days, from Christmas night to the fields of Princeton, and they would rank it among the most important stretches of the entire war. In little more than a week, an army that had done nothing but lose had suddenly learned how to win. A commander the world had already dismissed had shown that he could outthink and outdare the finest professionals Europe could send against him. And the British, who had gone into that winter certain the rebellion was as good as dead, now found themselves pulling back, caught off guard and quietly embarrassed, forced for the first time to take this ragged American army seriously. Trenton did not win the war. The Revolution still had years of hardship ahead of it. But Trenton did something arguably more important than winning the war. It kept there being a war to win. It pulled the whole cause back from the very edge of extinction at the one moment it was closest to dying. And this is where it is worth stopping to weigh just how thin the margin really was. Think about everything that had to go right on the single worst night imaginable. Had the crossing failed, had the ice crushed the boats or swept the cannon away, there is no attack. Had daylight caught those columns strung out on the open road, the surprise is lost, and elite Hessian troops cut a slow, exhausted army to pieces. Had Rawle's men been ready and formed, the whole thing could have ended in a massacre, Washington's last army destroyed in the streets of Trenton, and with it, quite possibly, the Revolution itself. Washington gambled everything on a single throw. He was outnumbered by the professionals, outgunned by the empire, and out of time. What he was not was out of nerve. Because here is the truth at the heart of that freezing night. The Hessians at Trenton were not beaten by a stronger force. They were beaten by a weaker one, a cold, hungry, ragged force that simply refused to behave the way a beaten army is supposed to behave. The single greatest weakness in the enemy's position was not a gap in their lines or a flaw in their walls. It was a belief inside their own heads. The unshakable certainty that the war was already over, that no one would dare come for them that night. And that points to something that runs through the whole history of warfare. The most dangerous weapon on any battlefield is not the sharpest blade or the largest army or the finest cannon. It is audacity, the willingness to strike exactly where and exactly when the enemy is most certain that it is impossible. Every reason the attack on Trenton looked insane, the storm, the ice, the holiday, the beaten and exhausted state of the men, was the very same reason it was never expected. The madness of the plan was its armor. A freezing river, a screaming blizzard, a holy night, a dying cause. Everything that should have made this attack unthinkable is precisely what made it work. And so the image to hold, as the sky lightened over the Delaware, is this: a ragged, unpaid, half-frozen army, hauling 900 of the most feared soldiers in the world back across the ice as prisoners, an army that, hours before, the world had written off as finished, carrying a revolution back from the dead. Here is the question I want to leave you with. That whole night turned on one decision: Washington standing on the far bank, hours behind schedule, dawn coming, and choosing to march instead of turn back. If you had been standing beside him in that snow, knowing everything was late and everything could go wrong, would you have given the order to go forward, or would you have played it safe and pulled back? Tell me honestly in the comments, because I think it says a lot about how a person weighs a long shot against a certain slow defeat. And think about the men who left bloody footprints in that snow. They did not know they were saving a country. They could not have known that a nation of hundreds of millions would one day trace its survival back to what they did in the dark that Christmas night. They only knew it was cold, that they were tired, and that their general had asked them to do one impossible thing before the year ran out. They did it, and because they did, there was still a country left to fight for.